The Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake. Book 1. Titus Groan. Barquentine and Steerpike. The inexplicable disappearance of both Lord Sepulchrave and Swelter was, of course, the burden of Gormenghast, its thought's fibre. From the meanest of the latter's scullions to the former's mate, the enigma was absolute, for the whereabouts of Flay was equally obscure. There was no end to the problem. The long corridors were susurrus with rumour. It was unthinkable that so ill-matched a pair should have gone together. Gone? Gone where? There was nowhere to go. It was equally unthinkable that they should have gone singly, and for the same reason. The illness of the Earl had, of course, been uppermost in the minds of the Countess, Fuchsia, and the Doctor, and an exhaustive search had been organised under the direction of Steerpike. It revealed no vestige of a clue, although from Steerpike's point of view it had been well worth while, for it gave him an occasion to force an entry into rooms and halls which he had for a long while hoped to investigate with a view to his own re-establishment. It was on the 9th day of the search that Barquentine decided to call a halt to exertions which were going not only against his grain, but the grain of every rooted denizen of the stone forest, that terraced labyrinth of broken rides. The idea of the head of the house being away from his duties for an hour was sufficiently blasphemous. That he should have disappeared was beyond speech. It was beyond anger. Whatever had happened to him, whatever had been the cause of his desertion, there could be no two ways about it. His lordship was a renegade, not only in the eyes of Barquentine, but, dimly or acutely perceived, in the eyes of all. That a search had to be made was obvious, but it was also in everyone's thoughts that to find the Earl would cause so painful, so frantically delicate a situation that there would be advantages were his disappearance to remain a mystery. The horror with which Barquentine had received the news had now, at the end of the 9th day, given place to a stony and intractable loathing for all that he associated with the personality of his former master, his veneration for the Earl, as a descendant of the original line, disassociating itself from his feelings about the man himself. Sepulchrave had behaved as a traitor. There could be no excuses. His illness? What was that to him? Even in illness, he was of the Groans. During those first days after the fateful news, he had become a monster as he scoured the building, cursing all who crossed his path, probing into room after room, and thrashing out with his crutch at any whom he considered tardy. That Titus should from the very beginning be under his control and tutelage was his only sop. He turned it over on his withered tongue. He had been impressed by Steerpike's arrangements for the search, during which he had been forced to come into closer contact with the youth than formerly. There was no love lost between them, but the ancient began to have a grudging respect for the methodical and quickly moving youth. Steerpike was not slow to observe the obscurest signs of this, and he played upon them. On the day when, at Barquentine's orders, the searching ceased, the youth was ordered to the room of documents. There he found the ragged Barquentine seated on a high-backed chair, a variety of books and papers on a stone table before him. It was as though his knotted beard was sitting on the stone between his wrinkled hands. His chin was thrust forward so that his stretched throat appeared to be composed of a couple of lengths of rope, several cords, and a quantity of string. Like his father's, his head was wrinkled to the brink of belief, his eyes and mouth, when closed, disappearing altogether. Propped against the stone table was his crutch. "You called for me?" queried Steerpike from the door. Barquentine raised his hot-looking, irritable eyes and dropped the cross-hatched corners of his mouth. "Come here, you!" he rasped. Steerpike moved to the table, approaching in a curious, swift and sideways manner. There was no carpet on the floor, and his footsteps sounded crisply. When he reached the table and stood opposite the old man, he inclined his head to one side. "Search over," said Barquentine. "Call the dogs off, do you hear?" He spat over his shoulder. Steerpike bowed. "No more nonsense," barked the old voice. "Body of me, we've seen enough of it." He started to scratch himself through a horrible-looking tear in his scarlet rags. There was a period of silence while this operation proceeded. Steerpike began to shift the weight of his body to his other leg. "Where do you think you're going to, Stand still, you rat-damned misery, will you? By the lights of the mother I buried, rump end up. Hold your clod, boy, hold your clod." The hairs about his mouth were stuck with spittle as he fingered his crutch on the stone table. Steerpike sucked at his teeth. He watched every move of the old man in front of him and waited for a loophole in the armour. Sitting at the table, Barquentine might have been mistaken for a normally constructed elder, but it came as a shock even to Steerpike to see him clamber off the seat of the high-backed chair, raise his arm for the crutch, and strike a path of wood and leather around the circumference of the table, his chin on a level with its surface. Steerpike, who was himself on the small side, even for his 17 years, found that the master of ritual, were he to have brought his head forward for a few inches, would have buried his bristling nose a hand's breadth above the navel, that pivot of a draftsman's eye, that relic whose potentiality appears to have been appreciated only by the dead swelter, who saw in it a reliable salt-cellar when that gentleman decided upon eggs for his breakfast in bed. Be that as it irrelevantly may, Steerpike found himself staring down into an upturned patch of wrinkles. In this corrugated terrain, 2 eyes burned. In contrast to the dry sand-coloured skin, they appeared grotesquely liquid, and to watch them was ordeal by water. All innocence was drowned. They lapped at the dry rims of the infected well-heads. There were no lashes. He had made so rapid and nimble a detour of the stone table that he surprised Steerpike, appearing with such expectation beneath the boy's nose. The alternate thud and crack of sole and crutch came suddenly to silence. Into this silence a small belated sound, all upon its own, was enormous and disconnected. It was Barquentine's foot, shifting its position as the crutch remained in place. He had improved his balance. The concentration in the ancient's face was too naked to be studied for more than a moment at a time. Steerpike, after a rapid survey, could only think that either the flesh and the passion of the head below him was fused into a substance of the old man's compounding, or that all the other heads he had ever seen were masks of matter per se, with no admixture of the incorporeal. This old tyrant's head was his feeling. It was modelled from it and of it. Steerpike was too near it, the nakedness of it. Naked and dry, with those wet well-heads under the time-raked brow. But he could not move away, not without calling down, or rather calling up, the wrath of this wizened god. He shut his eyes and worked his tongue into a tooth-crater. Then there was a sound, for Barquentine, having exhausted, apparently, what diversion there was to be found in the youth's face as seen from below, had spat twice and very rapidly, each expectoration finding a temporary lodging on the bulges of Steerpike's lowered lids. "Open them!" cried the cracked voice. "Open them up, bastard whelp of a whore rat!" Steerpike with wonder beheld the septuagenarian balancing upon his only leg with the crutch raised above his head. It was not directed at himself, however, but with its grasper swivelled in the direction of the table, seemed about to descend. It did, and a thick, dusty mist arose from the books on which it landed. A moth flapped through the dust. When it had settled, the youth, his head turned over his shoulder, his small dark red eyes half closed, heard Barquentine say,
"So you can call the dogs off. Oh, body of me if it isn't time. Time and enough. 9 days wasted. Wasted! By the stones, wasted! Do you hear me, stoat slug? Do you hear me?"
Steerpike began to bow, with his eyebrows raised by way of indicating that his eardrums had proved themselves equal to the call made upon them. If the art of gesture had been more acutely developed in him, he might have implied by some hyper-subtle inclination of his body that what oral inconvenience he experienced lay not so much in his having to strain his ears as in having them strained for him. As it was, it proved unnecessary for him to ever complete the bow he had begun, for Barquentine was delivering yet another blow to the books and papers on the table, and a fresh cloud of dust had arisen. His eyes had left the youth, and Steerpike was stranded, in one sense only, in that the flood-water of the eyes no longer engulfed him, the stone table as though it were a moon drawing away the dangerous tide. He wiped the spittle from his eyelids with one of Dr. Prunesqualler's handkerchiefs.
"What are those books, boy?"
shouted Barquentine, returning the handle of his crutch to his armpit.
"By my head of skin, boy, what are they?"
"They are the law," said Steerpike. With 4 stumps of the crutch, the old man was below him again, and sluicing him with his hot, wet eyes.
"By the blind powers, it's the truth," he said.
He cleared his throat.
"Don't stand there staring. What is law? Answer me, curse you!"
Steerpike replied without a moment's consideration, but with the worm of his guile like a bait on the hook of his brain. "Destiny, sir, destiny." Vacant, trite, and nebulous as was the reply, it was of the right kind. Steerpike knew this. The old man was aware of only one virtue: obedience to tradition. The destiny of the Groans, the law of Gormenghast. No individual groan of flesh and blood could awaken him this loyalty he felt for Groan, the abstraction, the symbol. That the course of his great dark family river should flow on, obeying the contours of hallowed ground, was his sole regard. The 76th Earl, should he ever be found, dead or alive, had forfeited his right to burial among the tombs. Barquentine had spent the day among volumes of ritual and precedent. So exhaustive was the compilation of relevant and tabulated procedure to be adopted in unorthodox and unforeseen circumstances that a parallel to Lord Sepulchre's disappearance was at last rooted out by the old man. The 14th Earl of Groan, having disappeared leaving an infant heir. 9 days only had been allowed for the search, after which the child was to be proclaimed the rightful earl, standing the while upon a raft of chestnut boughs afloat on the lake, a stone in the right hand, an ivy branch in the left, and a necklace of snail shells about the neck. While shrouded in foliage, the next of kin and all who were invited to the earling stood, sat, crouched, or lay among the branches of the marginal trees. All this had now, once again, hundreds of years later, to be put in hand, for the 9 days were over, and it was in Barquentine that all power in matters of procedure was vested. It was for him to give the orders. In his little old body was Gormenghast in microcosm.
"Ferret,"
he said, still staring up at Steerpike.
"Your answer's good. Body of me, destiny it is. What is your bastard name, child?"
"Steerpike, sir."
"Age?"
17.
"Buds and fledglings. So they still spawn 'em so. 17.
He put a withered tongue between his dry, wrinkled lips. It might have been the tongue of a boot.
17?
He repeated, in a voice of such ruminative incredulity as startled the youth, for he had never before heard any such intonation emerge from that old throat.
"Bloody wrinkles! Say it again, chicken!"
17, said Steerpike. Barquentine went off into a form of trance. the well-heads of his eyes appearing to cloud over and become opaque like miniature sargassos of dull chalky blue. The cataract veil, for it seems that he was trying to remember the Daedal days of his adolescence, the birth of the world, of spring on the rim of time. Suddenly he came to and cursed, and as though to shake off something noxious, he worked his shoulder blades to and fro as he pad-hopped irritably around his crutch, the ferrule squeaking as it swivelled on the carpetless floor.
"See here, boy,"
he said, when he had come to a halt.
"There is work to do. There is a raft to be built, body of me, a raft of chestnut boughs and no other. The procession, the bareback racing for the bagful, the barbecue in the stone hall. Hell, slice me up, boy. Hold the hounds off."
"Yes, sir," said Steerpike. "Shall I send them back to their quarters?"
"Eh?"
muttered Barquentine.
"What's that?"
"I said, shall I return them to their quarters?" said Steerpike. An affirmative noise from the throat of Strings was the reply. But as Steerpike began to move off,
"Not yet, you dotard, not yet."
And then,
"Who's your master?"
Steerpike reflected a moment. I have no immediate master," he said. "I attempt to make myself useful here and there."
"You do you, my prig? Here and there, do you? I can see through you, right the way through you, suckling, bones and brain. You can't fool me, by the stones you can't. You're a neat little rat, but there's to be no more here and there for you. It will be only here. Do you understand?"
The old man ground his crutch into the floor.
"Here,"
he added, with an access of vehemence.
"Beside me. You may be useful, very useful."
He scratched himself through a tear at his armpit. "What will my salary amount to?" said Steerpike, putting his hands in his pockets.
"Your keep, you insolent bastard, your keep. What more do you want, hellfire child? Have you no pride? A roof, your food, and the honour of studying the ritual. Your keep, curse you, and the secrets of the groans. How else could you serve me but by learning the iron trade? Body of me, I have no son. Are you ready?"
"I have never been more so," said the high-shouldered boy.